Mirëmbrëma dhe mirë se vini në kallëzo për një me. 24 vite më parë, bota u trondit nga pamjet që vinin nga rrëfimi i Prekazit dhe masakra që u kry në këtë fshat. Rënja e familjes Jasharit tronditi qytetrimin e mobilizoi vendin edhe botën për me marrë veprime që në fund e sollën lirin. Nëse bota nuk kish me i pas pa krimet që kryheshin në Kosovë, gjasat ishin që vrasjet, dhunimet e torturat të mos e merrnin fare vëmendjen e duhur. E në malit e Prekazit, në mes të datës 5 dhe 7 mars, qëndruan disa gazetar, kameraman e fotograf që me shumë sakrificë i sollën botës pamjet që dëshmonin atë çka po ndodhte në fshatin e vogël të Skënderajit. Henry Vaughan Smith, apo Vaughan Smith, ishte një prej kameramanëve që arriti të filmoj pamjet kryesore të sulmit ndaj Jasharajve. Vaughan u plagos në kohën kur po filmonte tek Jasharët, ndërsa pamjet e tij morën dhenë në mbar botën. Pamjet të cilat jeni duke i ndjek tash janë filmu prej Vaughan Smithit edhe u përdorën si dëshmi për të argumentuar atë çka ndodhi në masakrën e Prekazit në 1998 në Kosovë. Niste 4 vite më vonë, Vaughan Smith është kthyer në Kosovë për të nderu viktimat e masakrës së Prekazit dhe për me nda me neve historinë e gazetarëve të luftës. Vaughan, mirë se ke ardhur.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
You initially were a soldier, a British soldier. How did that come about and then you changed your profession?
I come from an army family. My father was a soldier, my grandfather and my great-grandfather going for many generations. So it was inevitable that I was going to join the army. It's certainly what my father wanted me to do. And I joined the Grenadier Guards, which is a sort of quite an old regiment. And you can see I have a red uniform. I had a red uniform. I had a bear skin, which is actually made of bear skin, bear fur. And I did that for 9 years. And I had to say, I loved it. I loved soldiering. I really enjoyed it. But
were you deported somewhere outside of UK?
Well, I did some United Nations work, and obviously in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
I did 2 tours in Northern Ireland. But it wasn't really the action in the British Army that I had hoped for as a young man. I wanted more travel. I wanted to be on the edge more. And so I met a group of people, a group of friends, people became friends, who were young, aspiring video journalists. It was at a very interesting time.
What year?
Oh gosh, that was in 1988. 1988, I went out to Afghanistan with a group of friends, and it was at a time when you could go to the shops in my country and buy a camera about that size and take video. And it was called Hi8 technology, Sony, and it cost you, probably about 3,000 or 4,000 Deutschmarks to get a camera. This gave her an incredible opportunity. Now, of course, today we can all film on an iPhone, but then you couldn't. You know, camera work was done with big cameras, expensive cameras, 100,000 euros for a camera. And so I could get small cameras, and that one's a very small one, but you know, you really could film. But of course, it gave you an opportunity. If you were prepared to travel with a small camera, you could go and stay with a family, say, and you could film what's happening in a war zone. And because I'd been an ex-soldier, I was very interested in conflict, and I had some training. I knew what was happening. So yes, I spent I spent 15 years, well, perhaps longer. Not sure. I really admit that I've stopped, actually. But filming, it was the most exciting and interesting time. It was an incredible
So what was
privilege.
the first story you did as a journalist then when you picked up that camera?
Afghanistan was the first story.
What years?
88, 89. I did Afghanistan, and I saw the Russians leaving Afghanistan.
So did you quit the army?
Oh yes, no, I left the army.
And?
I left the army and literally went to Afghanistan but there was I had a little job as flying a microlight. In German, that's an ultralight, a little aeroplane. I got a job as a little pilot, which was great fun, and that got me to travel. But it wasn't exciting enough. So I went into journalism, and I met some people. I started an agency called Frontline News. The agency lasted for 15 years. Half of the people in that agency were killed in the course of that time. So half of my friends who worked with me, that was a total of 8 people killed. There were only 16 people in the agency.
8 cameramen.
8 cameramen. Well, video journalists.
Video
I mean,
journalists.
we were people who took responsibility. We were all freelance, so we didn't have jobs. We took responsibility for our own journalism. We would sometimes get hired by bigger organizations, but we really had a free spirit. And would go around the world with our small cameras and try to film whatever was happening there. And then we moved into big cameras. It was anything because we knew our trade. But it was an exciting time. But it was also very grueling, very hard to lose so many friends. I mean, half my friends at that time were killed. But they were killed for something they believed in. They were killed because they believed that the only thing that really can make a better world is the truth. Is the idea. Maybe I'm a little bit more skeptical of that now, but I do believe that, the truth is incredibly important, and that we were prepared to go and risk our lives to tell the truth about what was happening in other countries.
I want to fast forward you to the Balkans.
Yes.
Bosnia, was it Bosnia when you first arrived here?
No, I did the whole Balkan Wars. I did Slovenia first. You remember there was that convoy of trucks, of lorries on the border. There was an incident there. I didn't get there in time for that, but I went out to Slovenia.
91?
I think it was 91,
Yeah.
yes. And then of course it happened in Croatia. I did Vukovar and Osijek, and I did a lot and then of course it went down to Bosnia. I spent a lot of time in Sarajevo and covering both sides, because obviously you have to you will completely understand as a journalist, we didn't go to the Balkans wanting to do anything more than tell the truth. You know, it's not our job to make history or change things. Our job was to try to hope. The theory is that if you can tell a country the truth, that is a valuable commodity in terms of promoting their ability to make the decisions, ideally in a democracy, that they need to make.
So before I met you 6th of March 98 when you came to Kosovo to film Prekaz. Before we go to Prekaz, what left an impression on you in Bosnia? Tell me what stays with you mostly from the work you did covering the war of former Yugoslav wars, not necessarily Bosnia, just former Yugoslavia.
I think that the work in former Yugoslavia that upset me the most was the human cost of the conflict. I mean, Srebrenica, where 8,000 people were killed. And the other thing that I found so frustrating is the misinformation. You could go to Bosnia, you could go to Sarajevo, you could go to Belgrade, you could go to Zagreb, and you could talk to almost identical young people, university educated, and they'd be saying the same thing. You'd just delete the country and insert someone else's country. There was this belief that their narrative was somehow correct, which is obviously absurd. You can't all be right. And of course, everybody's partially right. And it was frustrating to see that there was this inability to see the other side's arguments. And so this inability, and hence, whether Bosnia was a civil war, whatever it was actually described as, was sort of sustained by this sort of misinformation and misnarrative, often from diasporas, interestingly. It was very often in Yugoslavia, the people who were the children of the people who had left the country at the end of the war, who were capable of the most hatred of people of another party or another side. But it was the misinformation, but also the extraordinary level of human suffering. The thing about human suffering is I can report it, you can report it, we've both done it, where you can report some statistics that 100 people have been killed. What does that mean? Well, we know, we can identify what the sorrow must be for one person killed. They have families, they have brothers, they have sisters, they have friends. But then you forget the economic cost, the cost for generations of losing your house, your property, maybe having to move country. We're very poor at understanding the human cost, which we're seeing viscerally today in the Ukraine. And it's just shocking, and I just want people to understand that you know, we have to have empathy for people. We have to understand that sort of suffering, and we need to work together to try to prevent it.
When you talk about 8 years of covering former Yugoslav wars, and so little was done to stop that war, how can you then just explain that in Kosovo, in 2 years, we got the NATO bombing, and there was so little less done in Bosnia? Why was that?
I think you could draw a parallel to what's been happening in Ukraine, where Putin and his regime, and not the Russians, it's very important that we separate Russian people from Putin. Very important that we separate that. But you know, Putin's regime have been doing this sort of thing on a milder way for 20 years. In Grozny, where I was filming in Grozny. You've seen it in all sorts of countries. We saw it before in Ukraine, for example, in the Crimea and Donetsk. But it takes time, or it has taken time, for the West to gear up. And now the West is becoming stronger. I mean, you know, the West seems united. Europe is more united than ever because of the threat. And I think that's part of it. But also, it's very difficult to know what to do, and it's very difficult to unite separate countries into a sort of a formal resistance or a formal position or an agreed position, and I understand that. But I think Kosovo was incredibly fortunate, or those people, or the Albanians who value independence were incredibly unfortunate because they got that. But they got that partially because I think a lot of people, a lot of powerful people in the West, a lot of politicians, felt uncomfortable with their failure to stop the suffering in Bosnia particularly. Where if you look in Bosnia, and you know, you can see where the suffering is in a war afterwards by looking at how many people from different groups have been killed. You look at the statistics in Bosnia, it's overwhelmingly clear that the Muslims were the primary victims, no question about it. And I think there was a feeling of guilt, which I approve of. I think we should feel guilty at our, you know, I think we do have a responsibility to intervene to stop human suffering. And I think what happened is obviously it was Prekaz really that was the trigger, and the West then understood that the Dayton Peace Accord had failed to resolve the Balkan conflict, and I think there was a political climate then that enabled the West to engage more responsibly, I think, and you know, the rest is history for Kosovo. 6th
of March, 98. You arrived in Kosovo?
Oh no, I was there a little earlier. I came at the end of February. I think it was 27th or 28th.
Okay.
And I remember seeing a demonstration on the streets of Pristina, quite a small one. And that was the first thing I saw, my first view of it. And then I went into the hills to Likoshan. Okay. There was a smaller massacre in Likoshan. I did Likoshan. And then I got it. I actually I was in Pristina. And
what did you find in Likoshan in the end of February?
I came the day after the massacre. I went with. There were very few journalists, international journalists, at that time there, because I came on the last flight from Belgrade, because the Serbs stopped the flights. And I was on the last flight, so I was quite lucky. And I remember the BBC had said, look, can you take some equipment? They gave me 40 large silver boxes. Actually, wrong, sorry, I got that wrong. I wasn't actually on the last flight. I was nearly on the last flight. I had to take a bus from Belgrade. But so I was, and then you couldn't get in if you were a Western journalist. And Paul Wood, who was a BBC journalist, he got in because he was the Greece correspondent. He was able to get in that way somehow. But there were very few people in, which as a journalist was quite good because the story was mine. It was fantastic. But, you know, and so as professionally, it was fantastic because, but also the responsibility had risen. I had to get out there.
Do you remember what did you film in Likoshan? Did you meet the KLA then? Did you just meet the family members that were still alive? Yeah. Family
members who were still alive and relatives who'd come there, had gathered there. And so we saw a gathering. And that's what I remember of it, these distraught family members. And that was my first introduction.
I remember that massacre caused protests in Pristina. People were out to support the villagers in Drenica. But you came, can you describe to me then in March, your day in March? How did you get to Prekaz? How did you hear about Prekaz? Had you ever heard about Prekaz before?
No. What happened, it was on the morning of the 5th of March, because I went twice. I went on the 5th and the 6th. And most of the pictures you see, the ones that have been broadcast, come from the 6th of March. I went out there because I'd heard there was stuff in somewhere called Drenica. And so I hired a car and went off up there, and I was struggling because I couldn't find anybody who was speaking English at the time, because we met soon after, and that's when we worked. From then on, we worked very largely together with some other fantastic fixers. So I went up there on the 5th and tried to get to where I wanted to do, and I saw the Serbian forces, but I didn't get to Prekaz itself. I probably got about half a kilometre, and nobody knew I didn't know the word Prekaz. I didn't know where it was happening. I didn't know what was happening, but it was clearly a sort of military/police operation going on of some extent in the Drenica region, but I didn't see any guerrillas, any KLA or anything like that at that stage. I then got back. We got some pictures, and then the next day we went out on the 6th. And this time I followed the smoke, and ended up walking. And I found a guide who didn't speak English, so it was quite difficult because my Albanian still isn't as good as perhaps it could be. But we went all the way, and I got to very close to Prekaz, actually, very close to the hamlet. And I got up a hill to the forward slope, and I had to crawl for about 100 yards I had a large camera at that time, with a large camera, and crawled over the hill. And then I saw the attack going on, lots of houses on fire, and there was a very particular image that I remember of vehicles who were almost bulldozing a house. So this was probably the latter part of the operation.
Vehicles?
Yes, no, that vehicle, yes, and that vehicle, which is actually bulldozing a house. Now, the interesting thing about those vehicles is it turns out, I got them looked at by a specialist who said that they are Dutch vehicles. Those were the vehicles that the Serbs took from the Dutch army who, at the Srebrenica incident in Bosnia, where 8,000 people were killed, where the Dutch army withdrew and they left their vehicles behind, and the Serbs took those vehicles and they used them, interestingly, in the Prekaz operation.
What sort of symbolism is that for you?
Well, the symbolism for that comes from the fact that Prekaz came to be such an incredibly important incident in the Kosovar Albanians' sort of understanding of what their independence means. It became perhaps even religious in an intensity, in a manner in which the sacrifice, which is probably the appropriate word perhaps to use for the Yashari family, in the manner that you had the Serbs from this. It was a bit of a coup to the way that the Dutch withdrew. There was even, the government even fell in Holland because of the way that they felt that their soldiers had perhaps not protected people there. It was a difficult incident, which actually the Dutch handled extremely in a very mature way. The Dutch should have real credit for the manner in which they then dealt with it. But so the Serbs used these vehicles in an incident that got televised, that perhaps helped lead to their loss of Kosovo, is the way I sort of see it. Because the Prekaz incident became so important to Albanians it's an iconic incident you can't understand Kosovo Albanians today without understanding Prekaz.
So you did that filming. What did you have to go through to get that filming? From the moment you were crawling on top of the hills next to Prekaz to getting it broadcast, going through Serbian checkpoints, how was that process? What happened?
Well, these pictures, I'll go through the story of these pictures. I was with a friend of mine called Kenny Brown, who you will remember, of course. And Kenny had joined my agency and was my sort of assistant cameraman. And he was coming with me, which is good because, you know, I was using a big camera, so it was heavy, and I had a tripod, batteries, I had the full kit. And so I needed someone to carry it. We got to a point whereby we could clearly see smoke, and we were probably about half a kilometre away from Prekaz itself. And we saw that the Serbs had surrounded it and were doing what they would, in military terms, called a cordon. They were isolating Prekaz from anybody coming in. And so our problem was, how do you get to see any pictures? All we saw was the Serbian cordon. That's what we got the day before. We got the Serbian cordon the day before. And I saw an opportunity. There was a wood that we could go through, I think, that, and I remember the trees. They were sort of like oak trees and not very tall, so you had to be quite low. But you could get through that wood, and I didn't see any evidence of Serbs there. It was not a well-conducted cordon. It was not a professional cordon. And then there was an open field, but we managed to crawl around the side of the field and not be seen. And so we got inside the Serbian cordon. And then I went up this hill, not being seen, but I went alone. I left the others back because I knew we were very vulnerable. And I went onto the forward slope where I could actually see what was happening, and the pictures you're showing is what I could see. I had a problem because it was the evening and the sun was in front of me. And as a soldier, as an ex-soldier, I know a camera has glass at the front. So I was very at risk because the sun would bounce off my lens, and you could see somebody could see a flashing in there, which would give my position away. So I had to be very careful.
So this is you running back?
Oh, this is afterwards. The pictures you're seeing now is when we tried to get out, we got shot at.
Yeah. Because your camera reflected.
No, I hope not. I think I was just seen. Three of us were seen. I think we were trying to get out too quickly. I think we should have been a bit slow about getting out. You always want to get out quickly. We were seen, and a whole magazine, a whole Kalashnikov magazine of 30 rounds was shot in 3 bursts. In
your direction?
In our direction. Okay. Oh, very definitely in my direction. Yeah. I know the sound. And something hit me in the side. Hit me bang in the side. And I thought, well, I'd been hit. But I seemed okay. And so we carried on. At that point, I knew we had to run, so we ran out.
This is running?
Yeah. No, we ran out as quickly as we could because there was absolutely, we didn't want to get ourselves, shot. We'd been seen. So, and we ran for quite a long time and kept moving to get away, and until we stopped. And then I checked, and I wasn't in much pain. But my telephone, my mobile telephone, had a bullet in it. And so, I thought when it was, I was about to ring my wife was Bosnian, and I was going to ring her to say I was okay. Watch out, you're going to see the news, but I'm okay.
This is the phone.
That's the phone, yeah.
Lucky the phones were thick at the time.
Those phones, they made them rather more solidly than today.
What do you think would happen if you had a phone?
An iPhone.
Of today's phone.
No,
would have been destroyed.
Well, no, it hit me in the stomach, you see, and actually, had it got through, I would have been in a very bad way. So I was very lucky, and I still have the telephone today.
And from then onwards, again, what happened? First, Vaughan, now I'm aware you should have had a flat jacket with you. You should have had a bulletproof jacket going ahead. This is what we see today in Ukraine. Even presenters in the middle of Kiev doing evening news without going to the front line have a flat jacket. Why didn't you have it?
Look, this was, as you rightly said, over 20 years ago. And I think I've always been a great supporter of better safety practice in news. But in those days, we didn't take those things so seriously. I'm quite glad, because running away would have been even more tiring.
Difficult.
But no, I think today journalists are more professional in their approach. And in that day, we didn't have those systems. There wasn't the culture we have today, which I really support, the more safe culture.
And as far as I remember, you didn't either have a bulletproof car on that day with you.
No. Okay. We didn't have bulletproof cars then. I had a taxi which was waiting for me, and he was still there when I came back, and I was very grateful. But then we had a big challenge, and I was with Paul Wood, but he was there too, but he wasn't at the front where we were. But and we then went back to Pristina as quick as we could. To try to get it out on the news, because we knew we had a story, a really important story.
I remember being there with you, coming back to Pristina as you translated that day. Can you recall how weren't Serbs organized enough to stop us in checkpoints before coming to Drenica? How did we get the tape through?
The Serbs were never well enough organized to stop us getting in.
Yep.
At that time, they were certainly not organized enough. They had a cordon around Prekaz. They were not manning roadblocks. There was I think there may have been a couple of roadblocks, but they were easily avoidable. I think at the time that there was something about the Serbs. I think they had been told not to hurt the press, I think. And the Serbian military are quite obedient. They're inclined to be worried about getting into trouble with their superiors. So you know, as a journalist, you knew that, and you could just make sure that you know. If you
Not
were
only that, but
Yeah.
we came to Grand Hotel when the editing room was. We
Yes,
brought
that's
the
right.
tape in order to make the report ready.
Yeah.
Through that Grand Hotel, do you remember paramilitaries sitting in the lobby?
Yes, there were, because that was quite an interesting time, because the paramilitaries were in the hotel, and the Serbs had a sort of press misinformation office in the basement.
Misinformation office in Grand Hotel, first
Yes.
floor, I think. Media, they call it the media office.
Yes, of course, but it was
Yes.
misinformation, and we all
Misinformation
knew that.
office.
I seem
like
to remember
that.
it may have alternated in different parts. I remember it being on the basement. You may be right, it may be in the first floor then, but they had the misinformation office. And yes, it was very much a hotel linked to paramilitaries, Serbian paramilitaries, and we were staying there. But they didn't know what we had on our tape. But back to your point about getting through, I got to know the back roads or back paths in Drenica particularly incredibly well. With you, we both did, and actually they never were able to stop us getting in or out.
Okay, so one was knowing the back roads in Drenica,
Yeah.
but then what I am not aware of now is this mystery from the moment that we edited the program in the editing rooms of Grand Hotel, all the way to Radio Television of Pristina satellite broadcast.
That's right.
Because,
Yeah.
as we know, Radio Television of Pristina had Milosevic measures and people in it.
Yeah.
How did the Serbian regime allow pictures to be satellited out from that TV, which is today the RTK, all the way to the world? How did that happen?
It is extraordinary. But I remember that we had to race across Pristina with the tapes. We knew what we had, but they didn't. And there was an arrangement with the BBC and the local television where, you know, these are corporations, they're companies, they have arrangements where we can pay money to use their feeding services. We took this in, and I remember when you used to feed tapes in those days, you would put it in the tape recorder, and it would go out, and you would see it on the screen, and it's going live. And so I remember quite clearly that the staff there looking at this, not knowing what it was, it could have been, they didn't realize what it was. They probably thought it was perhaps something much more mild. I remember their eyes opening when they saw the images, but it's too late. It had gone. They didn't press stop. It went. So
I remember you made sure you don't have Albanian translators going to that building.
Yep.
Did you take Serbian translators with you to go in that building?
Yes.
How did that process go?
The BBC had a Serbian translator, but he wasn't there at the time. It's a good question. I'm so sorry. I can't quite remember how we did it, but you're absolutely right. We didn't take Albanians with us.
But then once they saw you are reporting on Albanians being killed, second time, third time, fourth time, how did they not stop the feeding from the Milosevic TV all the way to the world?
It is extraordinary, and I don't know. But they did also realize that journalists had access to very soon satellite trucks came in, so we could feed ourselves. You didn't have to use the local means. But it is interesting, and it was quite baffling the way they didn't stop us working more than they could have. They had banned journalists coming in, but if you were already in, and there was a few of us in from the West, then we were able to work. And it is extraordinary.
So
I don't know the answer
what
to that.
happened with your exclusive filming of this material? Where did it go? What effect did it have?
It had an electric effect. It communicated to my government in Britain, the government in America, the administration there, and everyone really, that Dayton had failed to resolve the Balkan Wars. And it did so viscerally because the pictures were strong. It was linked. There was also the issue with the bodies the next day, where the families couldn't get the bodies. All sorts of things were messing that we reported as well. But those images were extraordinarily powerful, and I think I think you could make a case that they changed Kosovo's future, perhaps, because the diaspora of Albanians around the world saw them. And other people in Kosovo saw them. They also knew, because it went on the information systems in Kosovo. But it gave images that supported the stories going around Kosovo. It electrified the nascent KLA that was emerging, brought people back. I think it fired the insurgency. There was something, because it's absolutely fascinating as an incident, I find. I understand 60 people were killed, and there was Basata, with the young girl, survived. But everybody else was killed there. And 2 Serbs were killed. So
two Serbs were killed? My
understanding is 2 Serbs. I think some were injured. But that's my understanding.
So militarily, you're saying it's a Serbian victory?
Well, you can't say that this is, by military terms, it's not a victory for the Albanians.
Of course.
But yet, there's something about it that triggered emotions in Kosovo Albanians, and today emotions in Albanians all over the world, about that incident that turned, a relatively small military incident that was, a massacre and not a military victory, into something that galvanized and led to NATO coming in. I think it's quite important to understand that, I had clearly understood that Albanians, for many years, for well over a decade, had been resisting what they saw as Serbian occupation, and they were promoting their language. They had a parallel education system, and the people of Pristina were fighting in their way for what they wanted for an independence. But there was this incident that actually was the thing that then triggered, and followed by others, as we know, that actually was a turning point. Historically, we can clearly see that now.
Don't you also think it's unique? Prekaz is unique because Adem Jashari insisted to stay there with his own family.
Yes.
He sacrificed his own family. It's not like civilians didn't die, but I know very few KLA soldiers who put their family in a front line. I find that of epic measures. How come? I'm interested to know whether there was a debate from then onwards in international circles of this sort of sacrifice. What does that imply in military and war practice sense?
I think it's very interesting. I've never seen it in any other story I've done. This sort of sacrificial thing. I mean, you could be horrified by it. It would have been perhaps horrifying if it hadn't triggered everything. If we weren't able today to attribute it leading to an insurgency that led to independence, it's possible to say, how could you let your family be killed like that? But then if you understand the implications, you can't say that, perhaps. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it leads me to an observation, which I clearly saw. And I haven't seen this. As I say, I think it's unique to Albanian culture. This sense of the importance of that sacrifice.
It's got to do with defending your doorstep tradition.
Yes.
What would happen though? Okay, that's the combination of that tradition. You go to defend your house, your doorstep.
Your hearth.
But there's the other side I want to ask you about. What would happen, you think, today, hypothetically, if there were no pictures from that day? What narrative would go out there if there weren't any pictures?
Well, pictures in the modern age are absolutely essential if you want to communicate anything. The world would not have heard of it. It would have been a tiny column in a newspaper. It would not reach the West. Well, today we can look at there were lots of horrible massacres committed by the Serbs against Albanians. They were awful, and I saw the consequences of many of them, and they were sickening, and it's possible to get very emotional about them. But the ones that were recorded by mainly international journalists, which of course relied on some extraordinarily brave and committed fixers, which were definitely a leading one of them. That access to international pictures, those are the massacres that are remembered, and those are the ones that triggered NATO's engagement. It's very important to understand that. For me, the ones that were key were, of course, Prekaz, Obria in Drenthe, and then, of course, Ratchak. There's a direct line there to Rambouillet. If those had been spaced apart by a few more months, the international commitment or interest that led to their engagement may have dissipated. Those three massacres served a purpose in bringing NATO in, and it is quite extraordinary. It could have been so different, but no question about it.
There is also, I'm interested in your opinion on the perception among Albanians, the narrative that also the patience and civil resistance that Kosovars led from 91 to 98 convinced the West that we are on the good side before people took up arms, before KLA took up arms. How much do you think there was any attention or appreciation of Albanian civil resistance and organizing their own institutions, parallel schools?
There clearly was. There's no question. The Albanians were seen as victims, as having been suppressed. I think there was credit for the fact that it was done non-violently. There's no doubt. But I don't believe it was ever going to give you your independence. There's no question about it. It was the armed resistance that led to your independence. You would, I believe, still today be in those times and suffering had it not been for it. But I think it is perfectly justified to attribute, in my view, that it did present you as victims of Serbian oppression.
Okay, 6th of March, you filed the story. What happened on 7th of March? I'm interested to know, did you come back for the bodies, to film the bodies? What happened?
I can't remember the exact date, and I apologize for that, but we came back to Prekaz and filmed the bodies. We saw the bodies. And I remember this, I found it rather amusing, statements by, I think it was a local representative, because I was sort of working for the BBC. And he came to me and said, I congratulate, in the very formal way Albanians, particularly in the countryside, can talk, which I always like. And he came up with this wonderful quote saying, the BBC laugh at death, which I thought was quite amusing because I have never laughed at death. but it just gave me that, I always remember that statement.
And what did he say? He thanked you for the
filming?
He did.
He thanked for the filming.
He knew you did the filming.
Yes, and told us that we laughed at death.
Yes.
And which I loved. It was just sort of such a charming thing to say. But it was more than that. You saw these bodies of there, and there was this issue about repatriating the bodies to the family and all of that was very uncomfortable and unpleasant. And it was very foolish of the Serbs to do it this way because the international news had a second hit at getting the story out.
I remember you were being given access by the Serbian side to film the bodies.
Yes.
Do you remember their version and from the version of the misinformation office in Grand Hotel?
Oh, they were terrorists and all of that. And look,
I remember you asking them, look, they're women and children. Where are the terrorists exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But we certainly asked that because, they were clearly family members. I mean, of course, there were some men of military age there, but the majority were not. And so, it was clearly a massacre. However much the Serbs have been goaded by attacks on the police and things like that, Amnesty International did a report on it, and we're absolutely, it's very clear that this was a sort of revenge attack. And this is what the Serbs used to do. They used to take it out on the civilians.
How was then your contact? By that time, you hadn't yet filmed the KLA. What happened from then onwards in your relationship with the KLA? How you built it and convinced them to let you into filming their actions?
It was quite difficult. What we would do is we'd drive around, because you have to get out there to try to find them. Of course, journalistically, the next thing we wanted was to see who these people are, talk to them. And they were initially quite shy. They wore masks, and we couldn't get there. And you remember this very well too. We couldn't get there, and we made contact. I was working with you. I was working with Fisnik Abraci. I was working with working with Jasharajve, and we were all working together, trying to help the BBC, get out there and meet them. But actually, I was finding that the people in the city didn't know who these people were either. There's a great separation, and I think there were a lot of curiosity as to who these sort of slightly enigmatic, hidden fighters were. And we finally managed to get in touch. I can't remember how we did, with a KLA fighter with the code name 10. That
10.
Yeah.
10 is Recep Selimi.
It was Recep Selimi.
10,
yes.
Dheci, okay.
Yeah. And he was the man who fixed it for us.
He fixed what for you?
He fixed an interview with the KLA, and it was all very secret, because the KLA were very suspicious of people who came in, and we had a meeting, and I remember where it was. You know,
this is Fehmi Lladrovcin?
Well, yes. That's Fehmi Lladrovcin, yes. But this is a meeting we had later, and notice that you're there too, as is Safed.
This is April '98.
Yes. And that was something that came later. And that was quite interesting, because that was 2 days before Fehmi Lladrovcin and his wife Jasharajve were killed, in a way that I think is not dissimilar from the Yashari standoff, insofar as they were going to defend their property, and they did, and they died doing so. And and this was 2 days before. And of course, it was Shaban Shalia, who was also in that picture. And I think it's worth observing, because
he's next to you, the guy with the moustache. That's
yes,
Shaban Shalia.
That's Shaban Shalia. And then I think I really want to observe to your audience the debt. I mean, sometimes over 20 years on, when people assess who's done what, and historians write histories, I think it's important to attribute credit to where credit is due and get the history right. There is no doubt that the international media, assisted by a number of extraordinary local journalists, from Koha Tatory and Veteran Saroy, he was very big then, and all the amazing people who were working for Koha then, to the fixers, Alida Ramadani, there was Benny. I'll try and name all these people because I want to name them, because I think they really deserve the attention. They were the people that assisted and allowed the international journalists to get the message out. But the KLA were very resistant to this at first, for reasons that are completely understandable, because if you're an insurgent or a guerrilla organization, you're not really configured to let the world in. You're supposed to be fairly secretive. It was Recep Selimi initially who had the foresight to say, we've got to get on international television, and the KLA have got to have a presence. We've got to be talking about who we are. We've got to have our voice. And he was the person that organized that initial interview with Fehmi Lladrovcin, which was in Drenica. And we could almost see the ferronickel factory. And then it was Shaban Shalia who was, for me, and of course, I didn't see the background conversation, so of course there may be other people who supported him, but Shaban Shalia took an incredible interest in journalists that he trusted to tell the truth, and I was fortunate enough to be trusted by him. And he took us around, and without that, people like Fehmi Lladrovcin wouldn't have spoken to us. It required somebody who was trusted, and so I think a huge amount of credit.
I remember we were vetted. We were vetted. Questioned. Who are my relatives?
Yeah.
It was quite a vetting process.
It was, and one should understand that.
Yeah. You spoke for hours before you got the interview.
Oh, yeah.
You had to convince them, despite the fact you were shot. You spoke in odas for hours and had lots of cigarettes that they were thrown to you. I
started smoking because of my trip here, and I've given up, thankfully, since. But no.
For hours. To get a half-an-hour interview, you spoke to them for hours in oda.
But it was part of the culture here. And look, I look back with enjoyment for these things, because you're soaking up the culture, smoking far too much. For someone who didn't smoke, as I say, I took up smoking. But it was very interesting, and after time, and after your reporting, because they could see your reports, but I was very lucky professionally, because I have to say, look, I'm a professional journalist. I do want to get to the story. I do want to have my journalism seen. There's no point taking these risks if it's not going to be seen by anybody. The fact that I was shot in the mobile telephone, that was a story that went around all the villages. And I could come into a village and say, oh yeah, I'm that guy, and it would open doors. So I was quite lucky. But it opened doors to the KLA, and helped by people like Recep Salimi and definitely and some others who we've named. And I also made other friends too in the KLA.
Right here, since we're talking about credits, Safed Gashi sitting next to me.
Yes, Safed Gashi, I'd like to mention him.
He was also a fixer, translator.
Yeah. Safed took me to Obria massacre.
What did you see in Obria massacre?
Obria was another very important thing, and I really think, and I must say, Uma Deliai, who was the sort of head of the family who lost so many men.
Still alive, remarried, had other kids,
and
big family.
And who's a very special person,
yes,
I must say. I have great admiration for him. He's a man of proper values, and I've kept in touch with him actually, and so have a couple of friends of mine who also.
All his family was killed. Yes. Entire family.
I think a couple of children. There was a little boy, but I'm not quite sure. Albanian families can be quite large. I'm not quite sure how everybody necessarily fits in.
But he had a baby killed in.
Yes.
I remember.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He did. But that one, if I could, sorry to interrupt you. I think it's important to attribute the importance to that massacre, and I think it's important because, and this is something that I've told Uma, who obviously, lost the most important thing any man could lose, or anybody could lose, their family, in such appalling violence. But that massacre, again, because it was filmed, because on the international news, and it was filmed by an AP cameraman as well, I seem to remember, it got on the news, and as a consequence of that, the international community, and Obria was important, they said, because before Obria, I'd been speaking to a diplomat who said, yes, but not enough people are being killed, we're not really going to get involved, it's a small-scale thing. Obria made them say, oh, yes, people are being killed. And it was another important point in the path to Rambouillet, and obviously Ratchak was the next one.
Then you also spoke about, just tell me today, when you look at the narrative of the war that was built up, largely glorifying soldiers rather than civilians, what strikes you there? Considering what you tell me that you filmed is mostly women and children being filmed, but do they get recognized?
No, I think that's an important point. If you look at how Kosovo got its independence, clearly, as you said earlier, the population resisting the way they did in the cities particularly was an important mark of projecting what was happening to the outside world. But it was never going to be enough. The KLA, the fighters, some of whom were women, of course, as well. There were some women fighters, and that's important to note. They forced the problem. But the people who suffered were often their families. I filmed day after day, and we'll all remember those images. Again, went across the world, and they were important too, of the human suffering, which was frankly enormous. I have images in my mind today of these poor families living under sheets with soggy foam mattresses, with children coughing, and old women and men coughing and often dying because of the circumstances. The price for your independence was paid by these families and their suffering, and they come from the countryside, not the cities. And I think one must remember the debt that one has to that suffering. It was that suffering that made the international community say, we have got to do something and stop this.
On that suffering, I remember you were also struck by somehow the lack of understanding of what was going on in the villages from the urbanites in Pristina when you'd come back. I remember you were being, you were quite struck by this.
Well, because obviously I spent quite a lot of time in the Balkans. And one of the things I've noticed, and it's strongly here in Kosovo, is that the sort of a sort of difference between those people who live in the cities and those who live in the countryside, and some resentments. And I find that a little distasteful because people who live in the cities have often only lived. Pristina is not a very old place. Most families here have lived here for a few generations. And where do they come from? The countryside. So I think it's an artificial difference that is not good for Kosovo and has led to some unhappiness, I think. Where I think the city perhaps, and remember, few people in the city fought. It was the countryside. It was the men in the countryside who fought. It was the civilians and the people in the countryside who did the suffering. And then I remember the sort of resentment as the war ended and the countryside came to try to get some of what they thought they deserved, flats and things like that. And I remember the sort of social problems caused there. And at the time, I thought there should have been a little more tolerance. And at the same time, of course, there are lots of complexities here, which you will all, your audience will understand, in terms of then the soldiers seemed to take political power, and maybe that wasn't quite as what should have happened either. But then they weren't necessarily getting the recognition. I would like to see more recognition for the civilian suffering, the suffering of the people, and an understanding that without pictures of that suffering, you wouldn't have got your independence. Whether it be the massacres of Prekaz or an Obria, that's what brought NATO in. It was a response to that human suffering, which was considerable.
You speak about complexity. This is one level of complexity. The other one is the fact that the guy who led the Prekaz massacre, that is known today, called Goran Radosavljević Guri. He's alive and well, working in Belgrade. And people who led the KLA, including 10, Vletri, Mr. Recep Selimi, people you talk about, others, are answering for war crimes.
I think there's a political dimension to the war crimes when it comes to the Albanians. I mean, it's clearly the case to me. I'm convinced of that. Well, it is obvious that the Serbs have been saying, and the Serbs said throughout the Balkan Wars, tried to attribute equal blame to everybody. Now, I think if you go back in history and you understand where that comes from and the way the Serbs were treated in the Second World War, you can understand quite a lot of the sort of history. But it would be good if this part of the world could try to leave some of the false narratives and understand that there's been a lot of suffering everywhere. But yes, it does make me uncomfortable what's happening.
But I do ask myself, Vaughan, were we blind to see any of these human rights violations by the KLA that were going on? Because I did not run into them in that time I was working with you from 6th of March, 98, till after the war. I ran into them after March 99, after June 99, coming back.
Yes.
But a lot of accusations for war against the KLA right now, war crimes, are for this period. How come you and me didn't see them? Were we blind?
Well, look, I agree with you, my sentiment exactly. I didn't see them. And I don't think we're blind. It doesn't mean that we know they didn't happen, because we didn't have eyes everywhere. But when it comes to foreigners on the ground, there were not many. I can't think of anybody who saw more than I did. I was absolutely out there. And of course, there are other people who saw a lot, particularly in Drenica I saw. And I didn't see anything like that. But interestingly, like you, I was disappointed at the end when things got a little rough in Pristina and where there was some revenge. I was disappointed in that. That wasn't what Kosovo Albanians were telling me they were made of. That didn't correspond, and that was unfortunate. But it didn't seem to me anything. It wasn't even remotely in the magnitude of the Albanian suffering. Not even remotely. But still, it wasn't what we were promised that how people would behave. I think that there is evidence of brutality against Serbs. There clearly is evidence. But it's unclear where it happened. And I think there are possibilities that it happened not as an organised level, but a level in a village against neighbours. And all of that is entirely possible. But I don't know. But I didn't see that.
One thing that I want to ask you if you saw is whether you saw 40,000 war veterans or 40,000 soldiers in your time traveling all over Kosovo, not in Drenica? Do you think there were 40,000 soldiers that today are beneficiaries of from veteran all sorts of salaries?
No. It's a plain answer, no. I couldn't put a number on it.
Okay.
In Drenica, I think, you know, there's a hierarchy of activity here. You know, there were, you know, some hundreds of very active KLA, and that may even be a few thousand. But then you see what happened with the KLA is as it was an idea as much as anything else. I didn't sense that it was always under some control. Clearly we can see that different areas of Kosovo were led by different people and didn't necessarily recognize authority from others.
I have to ask you which military person you met strike you. I'm asking now you with a ex-soldier hat.
Yeah.
Who left an impression on you? Because you met everybody who was somebody after the war that became politicians.
Yeah.
Who struck you the most?
I had a friend who sadly got killed called Chelly. And he was very much there. He was a great supporter and helped me get a film. And he tragically got killed. And then, of course, there's Shkupi, Marizi. They had
Shkupi's alive, Ferit Berisha.
Yes, and Marizi isn't. There was an incident he was killed, unfortunately, after the war.
What struck you about Shkupi?
Well, I found it very easy to get on with.
He was in the special forces, and he spoke 3 or 4 languages, right?
He spoke 3 or 4 languages. I met him on a checkpoint.
Yeah.
And there was this guy who spoke English quite well. He spoke Dutch. He spoke all sorts of things. And you know, he had a certain ease that you can see in someone who's travelled a lot. And we became friends very quickly. But it was those people that were my sort of access to the KLA. It was the sort of friendships that I made, and, you know, and the trust. They trusted that I was going to tell the truth, and that I wasn't. You know, if they gave me access, I would use that access.
It wasn't that simple. It wasn't just you meeting people in checkpoints. You had some guarantors from Switzerland.
Yes.
So you had gone to Switzerland before coming to Kosovo?
Yeah. Well, it all started when I was filming the Pope's visit to Cuba. Oh, I know.
Kosovo War? Pope's visit to Cuba?
So I'm coming back from Cuba, having had a job filming the Pope. And the taxi from the airport, I mentioned that I had a wife from Sarajevo, and the taxi driver immediately started talking to me. And it turned out that his name was Plurat Sedu.
Plurat Sedu.
Yeah. And he was working as a taxi driver in London, and he turned out to be very well connected in an organizer of the Albanian diaspora in London. And he told me all about what was going on in Kosovo. You've got to go there. And I thought, okay, this sounds good. I needed a trip, and I liked him, and I liked what he was saying, and he put me in touch.
Amazing. Why did he trust you just like that? Because your wife was Bosnian.
I think it was because my wife was Bosnian. I was talking to her on the phone in my bad Serbo-Croat.
Yeah.
And he recognised the Serbo-Croat, and because my wife was Bosnian, he was trusted, and we got on. We talked, and it was fine. And then he put me in touch with a guy called Yashar in Switzerland, and I went out to Switzerland.
Jasharajve.
Jasharajve. And I went to see this wonderful man in Switzerland. And
which place in Switzerland do you remember?
Geneva.
You just flew to Geneva?
Yeah, I went to Geneva.
After the taxi driver told you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. Because, you know, I wanted to get under the skin of this guerrilla group, this emerging guerrilla group. They'd been a little bit on the news. They'd fired some rifles up in the air at some funeral or something like that. That's all we knew about them.
Yeah.
And
the
I thought,
first time KLA came out, actually, Recep Selimi was there, Daud Haradinaj, it's an epic coming out, and Muj Krasniqi. So you knew about that moment, you went to Geneva. What did Yashar tell you?
Well, he gave me a bit of a grilling, as you can imagine, and I was in a room with sort of other sort of unknown men. So there was a group of them. Obviously, it was almost like a sort of, you know, the sort of political arm of a guerrilla group. That's what I thought they were. And I was able to negotiate with them access to the KLA.
When was this?
Oh gosh, this must have been January, February.
98.
Yeah.
But who put you in touch with Jasharajve?
Oh, it was Plurat, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then you had to go to another level, convince
Absolutely.
The organizers.
There was a lot of convincing at the beginning. And then I got given a bit of paper, a letter of introduction.
Ah,
I thought, I'm in.
A letter.
I got a letter from...
It's very 19th century.
Yeah, it was very 19th century. I had this letter. And so when I came to Kosovo, I had this letter and I thought I was in.
What did the letter say?
I don't know, it was written in Albanian.
I know.
But it said...
I think it guaranteed that you're kind of not a traitor.
Give this, I guarantee I'm not a traitor. Give this man access, talk to this man. He's international media, and we've checked him out, or whatever it was. And anyway, so I used this letter to find, actually, that it didn't seem to open the doors I had hoped. And I had a lot more work to do.
Yes, you were actually, with that letter when you came, with Jasharajve, you had previously negotiated to talk to Recep Selimi about the interview with Fehmi Lladrovcin. But
that was the letter that was used to get that
on the way there, we ran into Hashim Thaçi. Do you remember that?
I think we did. I didn't know who he was then.
Yes, of course. I didn't either.
Yeah, so I didn't know who he was.
He also vetted you a little bit.
I'm sure he vetted me a little bit. Yeah. But I didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
You know, he was obviously a younger guy, big tall guy.
Yes.
Well, we know.
Thin and tall. Yes.
But I met him. I met him a couple of times actually during the conflict. You know, you didn't see too much of him.
Yes.
But I remember him. I would bump into him because I was always on the roads, and I'd bump into him and the various people he was with. So he got to know who I was because he saw me around all the time. And he was always polite to me and helpful. And I think he, you know, at the...
Ramush, was he polite to you? Remember Ramush?
Ramush was, yeah, Ramush was. Yeah, Ramush was. I only saw Ramush once in the war. You came to me on that trip, I think, didn't you? Yes, you did. And we went, and I remember we drove down this stream, an armoured vehicle down this stream to get access. And we met Ramush, and he was an impressive guy. He was very impressive. But he was surrounded at the time, but then we left. We did a story there. But most of my work was in Drenica. But it was clear, you know, that Ramush had his own power base, and that actually it was very clear to me that the KLA was quite a resistant organization, because even if you could wipe them out in Drenica, they were still going to be there elsewhere. It was hard to eradicate the KLA militarily.
24 years later, you're here filming this interview on Saturday. Tomorrow you're going to the commemorations. What do you plan to tell them?
Well, if asked, I would like to tell them to remember the importance of the civilians. I'm very pleased to see statues of war heroes. I think it's very important for people to have these things. I would like to see somewhere in this country something built for the civilian suffering. And I would also like some recognition. I think people mustn't forget the role that very young, because you and I were younger, some very young fixers and the local press that understood the importance of getting the international media. It required the international media, it required television and it required photographers to tell the world about this place. Kosovo didn't have the ability to do that. It was this mixture of internationals who were professionally engaged and keen to tell the truth, and there were many of us, with the extraordinary support of normally very young, very smart, city-dwelling fixers like yourself, and other people we've named here, and I forgive all those who I haven't named. Forgive me, because I think it's incredibly important that that is marked.
Birma Bayram is one you didn't mention. Let's not forget.
I don't want to forget her. Certainly not. I did say Lida Ramadani. She's again very special. Did incredible work and has subsequently done extraordinary work. Fisnika Barachi, but it was and of course Kohës were essential, because they were the main news stream that we tagged onto. If I wanted a fixer, I would go to Kohës, and they'd often give me somebody.
I want to talk about the fact that right now, I want to link it up from that moment to today, when seeing the war in Ukraine, there's quite a reaction in Kosovo. Partly people are becoming a little bit re-traumatized and remembering what they went through. There's hardly been any treatment of PTSD in Kosovo, people who went through war. But before we talk about that, I want, there's a number of people who are down on themselves and with a lot of self-criticism, that apparently we didn't resist as much as Ukrainians resist today. As an outsider, do you think that's true?
It's true, but I don't see it as that relevant. I mean, the Ukrainians have done, they're extraordinary. The Ukrainians have extraordinary leadership as well. I think that's important. Compare Afghanistan, where when NATO left Afghanistan, the leadership fled. It's the fact that the president and his government have stood there and led by example is very important. Kosovo never had that leadership, and I don't want to criticise Rugova or anything like that, because I think what was achieved by Rugova is important and should be marked. But I think the Kosovo story is a different story. Kosovo is a small place, a small country. It didn't have the opportunity to militarily resist the Serbs in the way. The KLA had planned for a 30-year war, 30-year resistance. But it would have been very hard
So when
to
you
sustain.
when you met them, they told you the KLA was preparing for a 30-year-old.
That's what they thought they were in for. And I think,
but you also commented. I want to remind you, you and other journalists were saying that you were more sympathetic, but I heard others saying that they were amateurs, military amateurs.
Well, you don't become a professional guerrilla overnight.
And we're seeing that amateurs are doing quite a job in Ukraine.
Absolutely.
Citizens, normal citizens throwing Molotov cocktails at the tanks. So spirit counts, huh?
No, spirit counts, but I think the answer goes back to perhaps more understanding and respect between those people in the city who did not fight. And some of them can be quite nationalistic. And I'm a little uncomfortable with too much flag waving by people who didn't actually fight for their countries. But I do acknowledge that they resisted significantly. But at the time, there wasn't the respect for but I think.
There's another dimension. When you journalists left in March, when the NATO bombing started, in March '99, there were quite a lot of involvement of the cities. Gjakova suffered and fought a lot. So Dechan, Malishev, Raovec, all these were cities, Pea, where neighborhoods got burned because KLA was
I think I'm talking about Pristina.
Okay.
Where Pristina is quite different.
Okay.
I'm rightly corrected there. I am talking about Pristina. And that's because I was working out of Pristina, so forgive me for that mistake. But, I think the way this is resolved isn't by feeling in any way inadequate. That's not the answer, because it's not true. Kosovo got its independence, and it worked, and I think that should be valued by people. But I think what's required is a little bit of healing, and I think an understanding and proper recognition that the price paid wasn't by the people in Pristina. And that's okay. And I think that let's have some better recognition of the civilians, better recognition of those people who brought the international media in, because Kosovo didn't need to do what Ukrainians have to do. NATO's not coming for Ukraine. Kosovo wasn't facing that. It required someone else to come in to cause it to happen, and it achieved it.
Okay, I remember in the end, when you had to leave Kosovo and cover the war, you were quite upset. All the convoys of international observers, journalists, all that international presence just decided to leave on NATO bombing and leave Kosovo alone. You were quite upset.
Yes,
Do you think that was a good decision?
No, I didn't like that at all. I particularly was upset because a lot of the fixers I'd worked with, who I always want to champion, were abandoned by their television networks too, and were left suddenly, and it happened quite quickly.
But Ukrainians today stay, so of course we should stay. It's our country. It's normal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. From then on, you have formed Frontline Club to help fixers, to help freelancers, cameramen. How is your club doing? Who is it open for?
The Frontline Club in London is a club for journalists and their friends. It's a social club. It's trying to create a community, a community for journalists. I mean, I believe that, as I say, I keep saying, the truth is the most important thing. It's the only route we have to having a better life and more freedoms. And so, I'm trying to, it came out of Kosovo, this, actually. There was something about working here and the relationships that one had with other journalists that I wanted to, there was nothing like it in London where we would all keep our relationships and support each other. And so it was really about that. And it's still going. It's 20 years old. And we do an event program, and I have to say we drink and eat and support each other.
And how many of your journalists are who are registered with Frontline are today in Ukraine?
Well, there's a part of Frontline which it supports something called the Frontline Freelance Register, which is a register of freelancers, the type of person the type of journalism professional that I was, and there's 1,200 people, 1,200 journalists on that register, and we reckon at the moment, the last count this morning was that we've got 43 currently in Ukraine, and it's incredibly dangerous. As we know, a Sky television crew were shot up yesterday, and it looked like they were deliberately targeted. If you target the press, what you're doing is you're targeting information, you're targeting the truth. But then, clearly, the way that Putin's administration, in a sort of narcissistic fashion, promotes the opposite of the truth in a way that appears to have some purchase with far too many people. We've got to defend the truth. I think that for me, the Kosovo media, I've got a great interest in the Kosovo media and the work that you do and your colleagues, and there are many here. The one thing that I would find difficult to forgive is if Kosovo, well into the future, didn't attribute great value to proper, truthful journalism. I really think that the international community deserves that.
Thank you, Vaughan, and thank you publicly. I thank you privately, but publicly, for taking a bullet to put out a very important story for Kosova's history.
Thank you for your friendship and for interviewing me.
Ishte ky Vaughan Smith. Argumentimi I të kaluarës tonë është obligim për secilin prej nesh. Ne do të vazhdojmë ju sjell dëshmi për të kaluarën e ju vazhdoni na shkruajt në gazetarit.com për ata që po kontribuojnë që vendi me u rendit në mesin e vendeve qashtu që shjon, edhe për korrupcion, po edhe për sene të mira, por edhe nëse gjatë luftës ka dikush që ka dhënë kontribut e cilin ndoshta në 20 vjet e fundit nuk e kemi shënu mjaftueshëm se çka ka bë. Na shkruani në gazetarit.com. Deri në emisionin e radhës, mirëmbëjtje.